Welcome back everyone, and welcome to my fourth practice exam. Hopefully, some of you are starting to see improvements in your scores, and if you aren't improving, please focus more on reviewing your incorrect answers. And I know everyone has their own study strategies, but for me, going back and redoing all my incorrect questions after studying the solutions works very well. Also, for your weaknesses, I advise you to try using my systematic guidelines to help you recognize relationships among questions of the same category. Take full advantage of the question analyses because they are the unique elements of this course that will propel your scores tremendously. Without further ado, let's get to the solutions. Number 1. The National Park Network in the United States is comprising some of the most pristine and sensitive wilderness in North America. This is a question on verb tense. The original sentence is present progressive, which is used to emphasize something that is happening at the present instant. Choice D is being comprised of is also present progressive, but just the passive voice form of it. So it still focuses on the instant and therefore is also incorrect. This sentence presents a general fact that the park network in the US is comprised of these things. So we would want to use simple present because this fact spans across the past, present, and the future, not just the instant like choices A and D imply. And choice B, the passive voice form of simple present, is correct. And we need to use passive voice here because comprise is not an action verb, but a passive stative verb. Passive stative verbs express a state rather than an action. And since the park network must receive a stative verb, not do it, we need to use passive voice. Finally, choice C is also incorrect, not only because it uses simple past, which incorrectly implies that the park network no longer comprises of these things, but also because it uses active voice and associates the park network as the performer of a passive stative verb that isn't an action. Remember, the park network is not doing the comprised verb, but receiving the comprised state. Another example of a passive-only stative verb is a verb like consist. You can't consist or comprise something. Something must be consisted of or comprised of something. Not all stative verbs are passive only, but some, like comprise and consist, are strictly passive. Therefore, choice B, which is simple present and passive voice, is our correct answer. And by the way, the passive voice form of simple present is am is are plus a past participle, like we see with is plus the past participle comprised in choice B. Number 2. Additionally, variation in site-specific fish THG concentrations within individual parks suggests that more intensive sampling in some parks will be required to effectively characterize HG contamination in Western national parks. This is a subject-verb agreement question, so let's reduce non-essential parts of the sentence between the subject and the verb to get the subject as close to the verb as possible. In site-specific fish THG concentrations is a prepositional phrase, so we reduce that. Within individual parks is our double prepositional phrase, so we reduce that as well. And the reduced sentence reads, variation suggests or suggests. And we need to use a singular verb suggests because variation is singular. Therefore, choice B is our correct answer. Now remember, from the subject-verb agreement template of exam 1, I said often two choices will alternate singular and plural forms of the verb while other choices will be filled in with other verb tenses and usages. That's exactly what we see here with choices A and B alternating singular and plural forms of the verb suggest, and choices C and D filling in other verb tenses and usages. Most of the time, if you've correctly identified it as a subject-verb agreement question, your answer is going to be one of the two choices that alternate singular and plural forms of the verb. And that is exactly the case here with choice B. Number 3. There is concern that via global distribution, mercury contamination could threaten the ecological virtue of aquatic communities in the parks and the wildlife that depends on it. We have a diction question here, and unfortunately, word strength isn't very relevant here since the underlined word is a noun. Keep in mind that word strength is more relevant when adjectives, adverbs, or even verbs are underlined. Now, connotation does have to be positive here because you usually threaten good, positive things, but unfortunately, all our choices are positively connoted. So you move on to usage and ask yourself, do aquatic communities have ecological virtue, morality, ethics, or integrity? Well, virtue is behavior showing morals, and aquatic communities do not have moral behavior, so we eliminate choice A. We can also eliminate other choices that are related to morals, like choice B, morality, and choice D, ethics. Choice C, integrity, which means wholeness, is the appropriate word here, as the sentence refers to contamination which usually kills off parts of the aquatic community such that the community is no longer whole. So contamination would threaten the ecological integrity or wholeness of aquatic communities. And choice C is our correct answer. Moving on to number 4. Across all parks, sites, and species, fish total Hg concentrations ranged from 9.9 to 1,109 nanograms per gram wet weight, and this means 77.77 nanograms per gram wet weight. This is a question on commonly confused words. The word mean we need to use here has to be related to the range stated in the earlier parts of this sentence. Also, since a numerical statistic follows the word mean, we need to use a definition of the word mean that is related to statistics on the range mentioned earlier in this sentence. And when you refer to the average of a range, you say something ranged from this to that with a mean of XYZ. So choice D is our correct answer. Number 5 now. For the sake of the cohesion of this paragraph, sentence 2 should be placed. Now, any sentence repositioning question is a content question, so let's go back and read sentence 2 to determine where it fits in the flow of the other content presented so far. So here's sentence 2. Additionally, variation up to 20-fold in site-specific fish THG concentrations within individual parks suggests that more intensive sampling in some parks will be required to effectively characterize Hg contamination in Western national parks. We must look for a sentence which introduces the topic of variation in fish THG concentrations from a more general perspective, because sentence 2 is a smaller scale statement about the variations in different parts of the same park. Therefore, we will move sentence 2 to follow sentence 6 because sentence 6 presents the variation on a larger, more general scale, hence both among and within parks. After a more general reference, sentence 2 serves to focus in on the same variation topic by considering the issue at a scale within parks. So choice D is our correct answer. Number 6. Across all fish sampled, only 5% had THG concentrations exceeding a benchmark associated with malicious responses within the fish themselves. This is a diction question. You may expect that exceeding a benchmark in concentration of something undesirable, like THG, would induce negative responses. But unfortunately, every choice here is negative, so we have to move on to usage. Well, you ask, does too much THG induce malicious, murderous, venomous, or toxic responses within the fish? Toxic in choice D, which means poisonous, is our best answer, because the highly concentrated fish become poisonous, not malicious, murderous, or venomous. Malicious responses would give the fish intentions to harm, which is awkward because the fish don't really know what they're doing, so they don't really have intentions to harm. Murderous responses would make the fish dangerously violent, which is silly, and venomous responses would make the fish secrete venom. And since toxic responses just make the fish generally poisonous and not in ways the other choices make them act a certain silly way, choice D is our correct answer. Number 7. However, Hg concentrations in 35% of fish sampled were above a benchmark for risk to highly sensitive avian consumers, and THG concentrations in 68% of fish sampled were above exposure levels recommended by the Great Lakes Advisory Group for unlimited consumption by humans. Of the fish assessed for risk to human consumers, only one individual fish from Yosemite National Park had a muscle Hg concentration exceeding the benchmark at which no human consumption is advised. This question is one on punctuation. Well, this sentence spans a good 20 plus lines and is just too long. We need to break up the sentence to give the reader a chance to collect his or her thought. Additionally, the first part of this sentence referred to 35 and 68% of the sampled fish exceeding benchmarks for avian consumers and humans respectively, both fairly significant percentages. After the colon, however, the sentence states that of the larger fish sampled, only one individual fish from Yosemite Park exceeded the human consumption benchmark. One fish is clearly a very low and contrasting statistic to the 35 and 68% statistics presented in the earlier part of this sentence. So the contrasting nature of these statistical statements require that the two statements be separated with a period which is offered in choice C. And therefore, using a semicolon as suggested by choice B is incorrect. Also, choice A is wrong because the right side of the colon is not a detail or example of the left side. In fact, it is a contrast, let alone an example. Finally, choice D is a comma splice, as two related independent clauses must be connected with a comma and a conjunction or a semicolon, not just a comma. But as I mentioned for choice A, the two sides of the sentence present very drastically different statistics and so are not related, so adding a conjunction here does not correct the sentence anyway. So using the period in choice C is our correct answer. Number 8. This is a question on usage. A benchmark is a point on a scale or range. Therefore, it is best to refer to that point as at which. Where in choice B is used for locations, not points like benchmarks. Which in choices C and D don't work as well as at which in choice A because which refers to things in general. not specific points on a thing. So you can solve this entire question by just looking at the usage of the first couple words in each choice, but let's dissect this question further for study purposes. Choice C is also wrong because which advises no human consumption implies that the benchmark does the advise action, and certainly the benchmark does not advise. Choice D, which is advised for no human consumption, implies that the benchmark receives the advise action. The tense is advised is the passive voice form of simple past. So when you say the benchmark which is advised, since the benchmark precedes the words is advised, you are saying that the benchmark is advised. Choice A also uses passive simple past, but look what precedes the words is advised. It says human consumption is advised. Therefore, what is advised? Human consumption is advised, which is fine. So choice A is the correct answer. Number 9. Which choice most effectively establishes the main point of the paragraph? Well, choice A, mercury concentrations in fish in U.S. national parks, seems to be a good fit because the paragraph certainly does talk about fish mercury concentrations in a variety of U.S. national parks by providing a number of statistics and benchmark specifications throughout the paragraph. But let's check the others. Choice B is too specific and also irrelevant because Great Lakes is just the name of the advisory board that set the benchmark values, not the location where fish were sampled. Choice C, how mercury becomes concentrated in fish, is not mentioned in the paragraph. It just provides statistics on the percentage of the fish that exceeded certain benchmarks, not on how the mercury got into the fish. If it did, it would have mentioned how mercury gets into the fish, perhaps through diffusion, ingestion, or whatnot. Finally, choice D, the dangers of high mercury concentrations in fish, goes beyond the scope of the paragraph, as the paragraph mentions that there are values at which human consumption is ill-advised, but doesn't provide any further details on what actually happens to you if you consume such fish. Therefore, choice A is our correct answer. Number 10. Which choice most accurately represents the information in the graph? Fish THG concentrations increased from the first sampling to the second sampling at two sites, Sunup Lake and Center Basin Lake. This question is one on graphical interpretation. Well, first, in order for concentrations to have increased from the first to the second sampling, the lighter shade bar, which represents the second sampling, must be taller than the darker bar. So, if we look at the graph here, we see that the second bar is taller in only 3 of the sites, namely Sunup Lake, Center Basin Lake, and Lake Clark. Now, Lake Clark does show a slightly taller second bar, but because of the error considerations, there is no guarantee that the second sampling had a higher THG concentration than that of the first sampling. In other words, since errors can increase or decrease actual concentration, we need to account for error on the bottom side of the bar as well. So we draw an equally long error bar down for all the bars on this graph as shown in red on the bottom graph. And for Lake Clark, since the highest point of the error bar on the darker bar is higher than the lowest point of the error bar on the lighter bar, the second sampling could have had a lower THG concentration than that of the first sampling. This is just considering a worst case scenario where the first sampling was underestimated and the second sampling overestimated. So if the first sampling for Lake Clark was underestimated, the actual reading may be somewhere here. And if the second sampling was overestimated, the actual reading may be somewhere here. And clearly, we can select many more pairs of values within the error bar regions where the second sampling would result in a lower concentration. Therefore, Sunup Lake and Center Basin Lake in our original choice A are the only two sites where the second sampling guarantees higher THG concentrations even with error considerations. And this is because the highest point of the error bars on the darker bars are still lower than the lowest point of the red error bars on the lighter bars for Sunup and Center Basin Lakes. And finally, the last question for this passage, number 11. Conversely, fish THG concentrations decreased from the first sampling event to the second in 3 sites. Again, which choice most accurately represents the information in the graph? So another question on graphical interpretation. So now we're going to look for sites where the lighter bar is low enough relative to the darker bar such that the top error bar of the lighter shade bar is still lower than the low red error bar of the darker bar. This is considering the worst case scenario again, where the first sampling was overestimated and the second sampling underestimated by the full magnitude of the error. Decreases are guaranteed only in Upper Lena Lake, Poudre Lake, and Ypsilanti Lake. Similar to Lake Clark for question 10, Glades, Nenita, Mirror, and Kern Point have pairs that are too close to guarantee decreased THG concentrations in the second sampling. In other words, the top error bar on the lighter bar is higher than the bottom error bar of the darker bar for Glades, Nenita, Mirror, and Kern Point lakes. And because the top error bar of the second sampling on the right is higher than the bottom error bar of the first sampling on the left, the THG concentrations could have increased in the second sampling relative to the first sampling. Let me show you an example with Glades. The actual reading could have been here if the first sampling was overestimated, and the actual second sampling reading could have been here if the second sampling was underestimated, in which case the second sampling is actually an increase to the first. Therefore, Upper, Poudre, and Ypsilanti are the only sites with guaranteed decreases, since for these sites, the tops of the lighter bar's error bars are lower than the bottoms of the darker bar's error bars. Therefore, because even if you assume the worst case error scenarios, you can still guarantee a decrease shown by the red downsloping lines I'm drawing now. So choice D, Upper Lena, Poudre, and Ypsilanti lakes show decreases in concentrations in the second sampling.